Welcome to Kingdom Now, the podcast featuring faith with an edge, as we celebrate the kingdom of God within you. I'm your host, Dr. Leanne Marino, apostle, author, and theologian, and founder of Spitfire Apostolic Ministries and all the works that go along with it. I'm excited to share this program with you as we explore the ins and outs of counterculture Christianity present as you live out the kingdom of God in your everyday life. Want to learn more? Visit my website at kingdompowernow.org. And now, our program, which features a variety of formats here just for you. Interviews, teaching and preaching proclaimed everywhere from my North Carolina studio to Sanctuary and beyond. And powerful insights here for now as we turn the world upside down everywhere we go. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, happy whatever time of day it is wherever you are. And to our listeners in Tanzania, we say habari. We hope that whatever time of day it is when you are listening, that you are having a good one. And I welcome you to this edition of the Kingdom Now podcast. And I'm your host, Apostle Dr. Leanne Marino, here as the Spitfire, serving as the voice of counterculture Christianity, where we feature the theme of faith with an edge. And if you'd like to learn more about the world of counterculture Christianity, feel free to visit my website at kingdompowernow.org. And it is all new, and if I do say so myself, it looks quite good. So go on and check that out. If you've clicked on this link, you probably know what we're talking about today, because it is titled Your Practical Guide to the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Everybody's eyes are on the battle between Israel and Palestine as a result of recent attacks. And this is a podcast that almost did not come to be, because I had no intention to do an episode on the conflict in the Middle East, especially given I've already done a podcast that kind of generally swept over commentary on some Middle East issues. And that episode is titled The Last Days Part 28, the sequel. And you can go, if you are curious, and check that episode out. And I already have episodes done. We do these episodes in advance. So this is actually a special episode that is being done specifically to comment on this issue for this specific purpose. And we are preempting a few episodes in its wake, because recent events have caused me to stop and look around and think that maybe we can use some common sense on this topic. Because, to be honest, I don't like how most people are acting about the current conflict in the Middle East. I don't like the way that they're treating other people. I don't like how they're talking to people. And I think that this is definitely something, therefore, that we kind of need to look at. And so this is a current events issue. I feel like we're losing perspective. And the reason why we're losing perspective is because there isn't enough context. And when dealing with news headlines or social media posts, we tend to read things without any context, which doesn't lead to good results, which is actually kind of why people aren't being real nice about this whole issue to begin with. So, what I intend to offer here are the facts of how this situation in the Middle East came to be. And I want to start off by clearing something up. The purpose of this episode is to give information. Nothing that is said in this episode is an excuse to hate anybody or take out how you might feel on somebody else. We're not here to stir up anti-Semitism or anti-Muslim ideas. Every religious group has people who don't agree with the politics or policies of those who might also be a part of a group. And to be honest, the commentaries that I'm seeing online that I agree with the most personally about this conflict are from Jewish sources that I watch. I find them to be the most level-headed and reasonable in their thoughts on this situation. And that, as a fact alone, ought to tell us something. But we're going to understand more about that as we go on. And I also encourage everyone to check out the article that was published recently on my Pathos column. By the time this airs, it will have been about a week since it was posted. My Pathos column is titled Leadership on Fire, And definitely click to follow that column so that you can get updates about it. And the specific column is titled 10 Things to Know About the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. And it is up at pathos.com/blogs/leadership-on-fire. That's pathos.com/blogs/leadership-on-fire. So to start, how did this all start? Where did this all come from? Now, I'd say it's safe to say that most of us probably know the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians didn't magically start on October 7th, 2023. They have their origins in events that began much earlier. And most listening to this probably didn't know me back in the day, but if you did, then you're going to know this. I used to publish a magazine that actually started out as a newsletter, and it was called Power for Today. And if you actually want an anthology of some of the best of those columns that I wrote while we still had that publication, you can look up Power for Today, Practical Spirituality for Everyday Living for the first volume of the anthology, which were used in different editions over the magazine's history. Volume 2 is in production for early next year. And the second cover feature I did for the Power for Today newsletter back in 2002 was actually on Israel. And it was titled Israel's Demise and the Hope of the World to Come. And while I stand behind the basics of my personal perspective on the matter, I hadn't done the research on the history of the existence of modern Israel, so my opinion wasn't backed by a whole lot. I believed that because Israel was tied to something biblical, at least in the ideas and the way I kind of understood it back then, that Israel was held to a higher standard than the behavior and conduct we were seeing, and that as a result, they would face judgment for what they were doing. Part of why I wrote it as I did was because I was shocked, given the human rights violations and the blatant disregard for the treaties and boundaries, that I couldn't fathom anyone would defend the position of this nation in the name of the Bible. So I wrote with that in mind. And as I understood it back then, because God dealt with the politics of biblical Israel through other nations, I assumed that God would do the same thing again. Now, do I know if that's going to happen now? No. I understand the perspective, but I also understand things aren't done in quite the same way as they were back then, at least as far as politics go. So subsequently, since I've had a chance to dive into things a little more intensely, and there's a lot more information to share that helps clarify and understand the situation as exists today. The current conflict, now known as the 2023 Israel-Hamas war, started October 7th, 2023. A group of Palestinian militant organizations led by Hamas, and for a second, let's actually define what Hamas is, because I think that sometimes we hear these terms so much and we see imagery of things, we automatically assume that we know what something is when we actually are never given context for it. So Hamas is actually officially the Islamic resistance movement, and it's an Islamist political and military organization that governs the Gaza Strip of the Palestinian territories. It is headquartered in Gaza City. It also has a presence in the West Bank, which the West Bank is the larger of the two Palestinian territories that exercise control therein, or they have what's known as Fatah, which was formerly the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. And it's considered to be a very dominant political force within the Palestinian territories. And it goes back to the 1980s. It grew out of other organizations that existed prior to it. And they can be pretty extreme in the different things that they do. But they're not just an organization that kind of exists to stir up trouble. They are actually a political party. So Hamas launched a series of strategic and planned attacks on the nation of Israel. And they started during a Jewish holiday known as Simchat Torah, which is the end of the annual cycle of Torah readings. and was also one day after the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which is also called the Ramadan War, the Arab-Israeli War of October 1973, or the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, which started October 6, 1973, during both Yom Kippur and Ramadan. The goal of this war was to try and negotiate terms more favorable to Arab nations. Israel rejected the terms, and the results were fighting that never seems to end. So the current war that we're seeing offers a particularly graphic and ugly image of war, because Hamas attacked a music festival, captured unarmed civilians, took them to the Gaza Strip, and Israel retaliated, declaring war on Hamas. The Hamas attacks were a statement against the Egypt-Israeli blockage of the Gaza Strip, which has been ongoing since 2007, and that has literally decimated the Palestinian economy. So we obviously now know this isn't a new conflict, but how did this all start? Well, there are two main disputes in the continuing conflict between Israel and Palestine. The first is that Israel controls more than 1/3 of the territory promised by a 1947 partition plan. The second is that an independent Palestinian state has not been created. And both of these issues we will discuss later. But how this massive problem began in the Middle East goes back to two different time periods that kind of bridged in the middle, specifically that of Zionism and the role of British imperialism in the world following World War II. So now, Zionism is the belief that a Jewish state should exist in what was, at the time that Zionism came into being, the state of Palestine. Palestine, which is Israel and modern occupied Palestine respectively, had been ruled as a part of Ottoman Syria in a relatively peaceful fashion without much question from 1516 until after World War I. And people of different ethnic and religious backgrounds lived in Palestine in reasonable harmony for a long time. And then what happened is that in the late 19th century, a man named Theodor Herzl looked around Europe and through many different experiences, especially with anti-Semitism, which was very, very prevalent in Europe at that time in history, came to a very liberal Jewish belief system at the time. And part of their belief system was that it wasn't possible for Jews to assimilate into greater European society, and that they should and had to be self-governed. When I say this was a liberal Jewish belief, it was extremely secular in nature. It was not a religious Jewish point of view, and meaning that it did not espouse Old Testament interpretations or rabbinical ideas, but was one that was much more culturally driven, that divorced the idea of faith and theology from Jewish racial and cultural identity. So to Herzl and others who followed his ideas, they believed European Jews needed to relocate to their own land, as an independently governed Jewish state was a requirement for them. Originally, there was interest in Jews buying land in Palestine, but the original political proposition was the creation of a Jewish state in British East Africa, specifically in what today is Uganda. The idea failed, the focus returned to Palestine, and Herzl wouldn't live to see the establishment of the modern Israeli state. But overlapping with this central Zionist idea was that of Christian Zionism. And I'm going to go as far as to say that without Christian Zionism, there probably would not be a state of Israel today, which should make all of us kind of raise our eyebrow about this entire thing. There had been Christian Zionists in existence since after the Reformation, but it was more ideology than anything else. And some of you are probably wondering, and rightfully so, why would Christians care about the existence of a Jewish state? Well, I think that's a great question. There are different reasons for it, but the thinking is best explained in the group that latched on to Zionism in the late 19th century. So Christian Zionism gained its foothold in a growing evangelical subset known as dispensationalism. And we don't have time to get into the ins and outs of dispensationalism, but the basic idea of dispensationalism is that history is divided into specific eras known as dispensations, by which God deals with humanity in specific ways. And one such belief is that for Jesus to return, Israel has to be under Jewish rule. They believe this due to their understanding of Bible eschatology. Eschatology is basically the study of final things, both after death or end of life, and also, in a bigger sense, the end of the world. And it's important to state that their interpretation of which is not shared by all Christians. But I believe there was another motive, and while it might not sound like it on the surface because we narrate it as helpful and supportive for Christians to support the idea of a Jewish state, these believers had the same kind of ideas that were essentially anti-Semitic and running rampant in Europe at this time, especially among English-speaking countries. So what better way in their mind's eye view than to separate the Jews from everyone else, get them situated in their own place, and then, hey, as an even better bonus, we can hasten the time of the end and get to the point that involves us that much sooner. Okay. Today, Christian Zionism extends beyond the boundaries of dispensationalism. Dispensationalist ideas were kind of absorbed, especially in their eschatological nature, across a number of denominations, especially those that are evangelical. And I don't think it's incorrect to state that Christian Zionists tend to be quite loud and resounding about their politics on this issue, as they reflect the modern ideas about Zionism today. Now that there is a Jewish state, Zionists support that state politically and believe it must continue to exist at any and all costs. And as a result, they turn their heads a lot to Israel's conduct in the dispute. As a secondary point, those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s, especially around the turn of the century, probably can remember extensive prophecies that the Jews needed to remain in Israel because for some reason the existence of a Jewish state meant that there would be this huge mass revival of Jews and they would come to accept Jesus as the Messiah and convert to Christianity in droves. So me being me, decided to test this theory, and I already know the people who keep insisting they are right about all this stuff that they aren't right about are going to say it's still yet to come. The number of Jews who converted to Christianity in the 19th century was somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000. Today, 20,000 Israelis consider themselves Messianic Jews, while 45% of Jews in Israel consider themselves to be secular or non-religious, while 75% of Christians in Israel are Arabs. So apparently the nation of Israel isn't having much of an impact on this supposed conversion of Jews nor the advancement of the end time plan dispensationalists put forth. However, it is important to state that while this is often spoken of as a Jewish idea, not all Jews support Zionism. I think it's part of why Americans so poorly understand Judaism, because Christian Zionism is such a loud statement. We kind of annex the idea of Judaism onto Christian Zionism and assume that all Jews are along for the ride. And this is not true. Modern Judaism is not just one thing. There are three major branches of Judaism with a number of subheadings and smaller sects, and all have their own traditions, understandings, and interpretations of Jewish eschatology. Some Jews believe Israel will not return to the Promised Land until after the Messiah appears, leading them into it himself. Others believe there should be both an Israeli state and a Palestinian state together. Some believe in the state of Israel but don't support its actions. Some Jews believe Israel must exist under the governance of other nations. So, quote unquote, supporting Israel does not equate to supporting Jewish ideas or Jewish people. And feeling that Israel is in the wrong for how they have systemically treated the Palestinians is not anti-Semitic. So how did this partitioning that I mentioned earlier come into existence? We now have a basic idea of Zionism, which was first supposed to be in East Africa. Then that failed. And then we have the reality that modern-day Israel is not biblical Israel. Biblical Israel has not existed since 722 BC. And the reason why Israel exists today has nothing to do with the Bible, but everything to do with growing politics, and in particular, the First and Second World Wars. In my column, I don't get into the concept of mandatory Palestine, but we are going to discuss it some here. So during World War I, there was an Arab uprising against the Ottoman rule of Palestine. The British, having a military formation in Egypt, drove the Ottoman Turks out. Now the plot thickens, because Britain said they would honor Arab independence if the Arabs rose up against the Ottomans. But in the end, Britain and France divided up the conquered territory, which was rightly seen as an act of betrayal to the Arabs. Then in 1917, Britain promised support for a Jewish national home in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration, further creating negative blood between everyone involved. And the British and French formed a joint occupied enemy territory administration in Ottoman Syria known as Mandatory Palestine. And through the League of Nations, the British were found with the right to administer occupation until the defunct Ottoman Empire could now stand on its own. In response, Jews started moving into the area, and both Jews and Arabs started nationalist movements in the area, and conflicts and revolts started, including Arab revolts and Jewish insurgencies. And then there was World War II. After World War II, Britain was unable to financially support its various occupations around the world and terminated their rule in Palestine, pulling their governance out in 1948. And Palestine was not the only place that Britain pulled out of. We also very well know, for example, about the Pakistani-India conflict, which was also created by this situation, as were Britain pulling out in a number of different African countries. A year earlier, in 1947, the United Nations approved a partition plan to divide the land into a Jewish portion and a Palestinian portion, and both nations would independently govern. So part of this plan was the existence of a Palestinian state. And the plan started a civil war between Arabs and Jews, and ever since the two have been in constant conflict, both with one another and with their neighbors. So yes, this was a political boundary with political solutions created by politics. It's not the fulfillment of a prophecy, and it's not something that, to be honest, has proven to be a very smart idea. There have been a number of resulting conflicts ever since, over and over again, with Israel failing to follow the partition agreement. First, Palestine is occupied by Israel, which was not an agreement. They were supposed to have their own state and their own specified territory, and this has never happened. Despite attempts for the UN to investigate Israel's treatment of Palestine, Israel refuses to cooperate. And for whatever reason, the mess just goes on and on and on. Different nations have picked sides. In particular, the United States often considers itself an ally of Israel because it wants a foothold in Arab countries. And the dispute and mounting conflict reaches an explosive point, and then stuff happens. Out of 192 member nations of the United Nations, 139 recognize Palestine as an independent state. Among the G20, 9 nations recognize Palestine's autonomy, while 10 do not. And among these 10 are, you guessed it, the United States and Britain, who threw Palestine under the bus decades ago and just keeps doing it. The current occupation of Palestine has been ongoing since 1967, and it is the longest occupation in modern history. As already stated, Israel has implemented a blockade of the Gaza Strip since 2007, which has devastated their economy. Palestinians face an unemployment rate of 25.7% versus Israel, whose rate is 3.4%. The life expectancy among Palestinian males is 10 years younger than it is for Israeli males, while it is 8 years younger for Palestinian women than Israeli women. Israel controls Palestine's water supply, causing shortages. In this particular conflict, that means to bring in aid and supplies to Palestine, Israel has blocked everything. The power grid, water, and all utilities to Palestine have been cut off by Israel. People use underground tunnels to access food and supplies on a regular basis when they're not in an active military conflict. There are people who haven't seen their families in generations because of the political divide. There are military checkpoints throughout the country, and doing ordinary boring tasks can take hours, sometimes up to 10 or 12 hours. If we look at the facts, it's very obvious Palestine is responding to an oppression, to something specific. And it appalls me that the governing agencies in Israel have become occupiers by some sort of vague or abstract right. It's not Palestine's fault that Israel doesn't want to share. And at the same time, Palestine needs to find a way to manage this situation that is more productive than these very outrageous and violent statements that kill, rape, torture, and imprison innocent people. While I certainly understand their frustration, it always seems like the innocent people are the ones who suffer. Conflict is a way of life for people in these countries. We only hear about it when it's of interest to our nation, and the only reason we heard about it this time is because Americans were involved as hostages. But people live under these conditions all the time, afraid they won't see their children or their spouses again, never hearing from friends and not being sure if they died or moved on or what happened to them. They deal with military checkpoints and stop points and an inability to do things like work or go to school. Hate is part of the lives of both Jews and Arabs embroiled in this conflict. Maybe who they should be mad at are the British, or all these other nations that keep getting involved. And not only are we experiencing the loss of essential history, both in buildings and land structures, there are minority ethnic groups such as the Samaritans, the Druze, and the Circassians, who already face uncertain futures as their numbers dwindle, now are facing annihilation because of these issues present between the larger groups. What do Christians need to examine in themselves? We need to first of all realize that these issues really don't involve us, and that maybe we should stop throwing our Palestinian brethren under the bus in favor of a nation that has an entirely secular history. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a spiritual battle, it's a natural land dispute. God didn't instruct anyone to move in and take over Israel because Britain ran out of money, when Britain shouldn't have been there to begin with. Modern Israel does not receive guidance from a central prophet or from central spiritual leaders. If anything, they are operating like people who have no accountability. Because as a nation, they do not have a spiritual outlook in their governance. They aren't fearing God or recognizing God's power in good governance, which is an essential thing. In the Bible, Israel's leaders were required to rule in a certain way, or they had to answer to someone else, a higher source, if you will, whether God himself or spoken through a prophet, or often both. And because biblical Israel didn't follow their end of things, they lost their land. God used different nations to implement a sense of divine judgment, which is a fact that makes a lot of us uncomfortable. Do I believe that is going to happen today? I don't know. I suppose it's possible. Today's governmental system doesn't quite play by the same rules as they did of old. And I do believe that God still intervenes in modern situations. But sometimes the narration of those things is different than it was in biblical times. But I believe in a bigger sense this shows us why mixing politics with spirituality is just not really a very good thing. For one, Christians who are Zionists turn their head the other way at the obvious abuses of Israel, and they give the impression that anything goes as long as Israel does it. And this is wrong, as we pointed out, even in the history of biblical Israel. God didn't just let anyone do anything they wanted without consequence. That's actually a rather unbiblical attitude to have. And many Christians are decidedly unfair in their assessment of things. For one, Christian Zionism has led to a ton of anti-Muslim sentiment. I would almost say that there are Christians who downright hate Muslims, and I just feel that that's wrong. I think it's wrong for us to be hating anybody like that, especially because it's based on the wrong information or on the wrong narration. And before y'all come in and start telling me crap, that's crap. All nations have violent histories, and I don't deny the violent history of Islam because Islam does have a very violent history. But the establishment of this state and the reaction of the Arabs are the fact that they got a bad deal. That they've been getting one since the First World War, and that nobody's honoring that and nobody's respecting that fact. And that's probably why Arabs aren't real thrilled with the Western world, because they come in and they modify things and they've burned people. It's very much the equivalent of what happened between Native Americans and the United States of America in land treaties. Things were promised that didn't happen. And I'm going to give you a very common example of where Christians don't often judge things rightly. Someone pointed out to me recently that we flip over a burqa, which is the veil that Muslim women wear, but we think an Orthodox Jewish woman wearing a headscarf or a wig is perfectly fine. We don't see any issue with it. And to be quite honest, they all wear those things for very similar reasons. But when one does it versus the other, it's perceived very differently. The next reason is because there should never be such a thing as unconditional politics. We should never unconditionally support anybody's politics, because no one and no nation is untouchable. And nations today are ruled by human beings who make mistakes, who are trying to play a game and are trying to dispute over things, whether it's territories or land or economics or money. They're not doing it for holy reasons. And there's a reason that the Bible tells us to pray for the peace of cities or nations and not specifically for the politics involved. We can pray for rulers, and we should pray for rulers, that they rule wisely and justly, that they exercise good judgment, that they remember the people who are involved in these different battles and disputes and the things that happen and the terrible effects that war and injustice have on people. But it's fine to wish that things don't turn into a gigantic pissing contest, which is what this always feels like. But it's not our posture to get involved to the point where we fail to recognize what is right and just ourselves. Because our integrity and our moral compass as Christians don't come from the world, and they don't come from worldly governments. Because Christians shouldn't be formed by political ideas. Whether we like that or we don't, it's a fact. Our personal views, our personal faith, and our personal conduct should not be decided by political actions that are of this world. Psalm 122, 6 through 9, in the Expanded Bible says, "Pray, ask for peace in Jerusalem. May those who love her be safe, prosper. May there be peace within her walls, ramparts, and safety, security within her strong towers. To help my relatives, brothers, and friends, neighbors, I say, let Jerusalem have peace. Peace be within you. For the sake of the temple, house of the Lord our God, I seek good prosperity for her." There are no politics involved in that prayer. And it prays for the inhabitants, for the people who are there. And I say that for the people in these lands, we can pray the same thing. May we pray for their peace. May we pray for their prosperity. May we pray not just for the absence of war, but for sincere peace that is resolved, because everyone involved comes to the relevance and importance of the need to do the right thing. I thank you for listening to this program today, and I do pray that it's been a blessing to you. And I've got some recommended reading for y'all. The first is to check out my Pathos column at pathos.com/blog/leadership-on-fire. That's pathos.com/blog/leadership-on-fire for the Leadership on Fire column, which has a specific article on the conflict in the Middle East titled 10 Things to Know About the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, and it is up again at Leadership on Fire at pathos.com/blogs/leadership-on-fire. I also encourage you to go back in the archives and listen to the episode, The Last Days Part 28, the sequel. That's The Last Days Part 28, the sequel of the Kingdom Now podcast, which does focus a little bit more on dispensationalism. So you definitely want to check that out. Also, check out my book, which I did mention earlier in this particular episode, Power for Today, Volume 1, Practical Spirituality for Everyday Living. That's Power for Today, Volume 1, Practical Spirituality for Everyday Living. It is available on Amazon.com and wherever books are sold in both paperback and ebook format. Go look it up today. Look me up, Dr. Leanne B. Marino, and all of my titles come up. There is something for everybody there. Go check it out and find something today. Also, The Complete Idiot's Guide to Middle East Conflict by Mitchell G. Bard provides a lot of context for these different issues, even if it doesn't cover the current events, because it is from a few years back. That's The Complete Idiot's Guide to Middle East Conflict by Mitchell G. Bard. Definitely check that out. If you are online, I would love to connect with you. Let's have a conversation. Let's have a discussion. There's a lot going on social media these days. You can follow along and keep up with all the different things that I'm doing at Kingdom Power Now. That's at Kingdom Power Now. And I am on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, WordPress, and beyond. So check that out at Kingdom Power Now. I would love to hear from you. Let's start that conversation. Also, if you are interested in learning more about counterculture Christianity, feel free to visit my website at kingdompowernow.org. That's kingdompowernow.org. If you're interested in seminary, where you can learn about all things related to stuff we're talking about here with a practical and affordable option, that makes sure you will use everything that you learn. Check out Apostolic University Seminary at apostolicuniversity.org. That's apostolicuniversity.org. And if you're in the Charlotte, North Carolina area and you seek no favoritism, just family, check out the work of Sanctuary at welcomeinThisPlace.org. That's welcomeinThisPlace.org. And Sanctuary's website is also all new. Looks awesome, is great. Check it out. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us and we will get back to you. And this is Apostle Dr. Leanne Marino reminding you in closing that politics distort, but truth is eternal. Don't let the politics of this world erode you of your sense of right and wrong. Until next time, be blessed. Thank you for joining us on Kingdom Now. I pray it proves to be a blessing in your life. To learn more about this work, ask a question, submit feedback or a topic suggestion, advertise on air, or donate to this work, visit my website, which contains essential information and links for other points of contact around the web at kingdompowernow.org. Also, if you are in our area and would like to visit Sanctuary International Fellowship Tabernacle SIFT, visit welcomeinThisPlace.org. Until next time, this is Apostle Dr. Leanne Marino reminding you that the kingdom of God is within you, and that means the kingdom is now.